Hi. There we go. Much better. Hello, Kathy. You all set? Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's program at New Canaan Library. I'm Susan LaPerla, the Director of Programming here, and it is a real pleasure to have Alisa Solomon with us today to talk about Fiddler on the Roof. But before we start with that, Marcy Schoenfeld would like to make a few announcements today.
Standing ovation. No. Hi, I'm Marcy Schoenfeld. I'm co-president of programming and education, thank you, for the Jewish Historical Society. My co-vice president is in Maryland at her granddaughter's play. So well, she has the wrong priorities, I just guess, not being here. Anyway, I'd like to thank Susan and her staff. They have been wonderful. This is at least the third year that I'm involved in the programs with her, and they couldn't be more accommodating. And so thank you for myself and Alisa and the board. So thank you so much. I just want to talk a little bit about our June program. It's the last program for the season. If you are on our mailing list, you should have gotten on Saturday this form. Some of you have, it might be on your seats. It's about the June program. Or some of you got this on your seats, which is both the May and the June program. It's at, we're being unfaithful to New Canaan. It's going to be at the Darien Library, which is a first for us. I'm sorry. It's a first for us there. It's called A Child of Christian Blood. It's a true story of the Bellis blood libel case in Russia. Also, this coming Wednesday, we have book talks. What's different about our book talks is you don't have to read the book. The person talks about the book, and actually I've done a few of these where I said, oh, that sounds interesting, and then I go out and read the book. Some people actually read it beforehand. It's The Storyteller by Jody Picotte. Sandra Meltzer, who was chairman of the English department at West Hill High School and is taught at college level, will be discussing the book, and she has her own following. It's unusual. Usually we have it at the JCC at 10 o'clock, but this will be at the Harry Bennett at 2 p.m. on this coming Wednesday. What? All right. You also should have gotten this blue form, and it might be, if you don't have it, we have more in the back. We believe strongly in not charging for our programs, but obviously there is a cost for every program that we do. So if you're not a member, please seriously think about becoming a member, because it's important to us continue these programs without charging. And, you know, I hate to cut back on the food too, because I know everyone enjoys it. So one last thing is that I was asked if you didn't sign in the back, please do so. Oh, and one last thing. There are some people who need rides to our events. So if you are part of this organization and you know people who need rides, you know, please call them up and say, hey, do you need a lift this Sunday or Wednesday, whatever, because it's important to them. They really want to come, but they really have no way of getting there. So we would really appreciate it. We only have that last program in June, so think about these things for next year. And you want to talk about, Ava, you want to talk about the 30th anniversary? Okay. Okay. And with that, I'm going to introduce Ava Weller, who is the president of the Jewish Historical Society.
Good afternoon. The Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Thank you, Marcy. What a lovely spring day it is today, and it's also the Jewish holiday of Lag BaOmer. I don't know if you know what that is, but it has to do with counting until we receive the Torah. It's also very special for us to be here again at the New Canaan Library for an extraordinary program. We thank the New Canaan Library for hosting the program and for being such a great partner this year, especially where we've had multiple programs here. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you today, and I'm glad that you chose to be with us. I also want to thank the JHS Program and Education VPs Marcy Schoenfeld and Alisa Kaplan for coordinating yet another interesting and entertaining program. Thanks to all who help with food and refreshments. Some of you may not know that the fall of 2014 is JHS's 30th year, and that the Bridgeport Jewish Historical Society is now part of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. We're only one of 3 Jewish historical societies in the whole state. I hope you'll celebrate with us at a special event on September 14th. Mark your calendars now. All are welcome, but if you're not yet a member to the Jewish Historical Society, we hope that you will consider becoming one. The blue card is our membership card. Please take a look at our membership brochure, and if you haven't signed in, please sign in. You don't have to be Jewish, but if you sign in, you'll be on our mailing list at least for a short while. The JHS maintains the only Jewish archives in Fairfield County, and it's located at 990 Hope Street in Stamford. We welcome donations of memorabilia, artifacts, photographs. We continue to collect stories and memories about local history through our Oral History Project, and we are now recording Jewish veterans from all wars with the Veterans History Project connected to the National Archives. The JHS Lending Library is located at the Stanford JCC with a wide selection of books for all ages on Jewish topics and houses an extensive Holocaust collection. We also now offer DVDs on Jewish themes for all audiences. While you are there, please take a few moments to see the JHS display, which is located near the entrance. It's a changing exhibit that we have, and it usually highlights things from our archives. JHS also holds monthly book talks, as Marcy had mentioned, and we also have a traveling exhibit. In that exhibit, and I hope you'll get to see it sometime, maybe here, there is a story, an article about a shocking event that took place here in New Canaan. JHS also has materials to help you gather genealogical information about your families through its Heritage at Home program, and of course we hold monthly programs throughout the year, except for the summer. We really have something for everyone. And now the speaker will be introduced. Thank you so much.
Before I introduce Alisa, I just have one more announcement. The library is closing at 5 o'clock, which means that the sliding doors will be locked upstairs. If you need to exit to the parking lot upstairs, just let Kathy, who's helping me today, or me know, and I can show you how to exit through the staff door, which is on that level. This door you can just leave by at any time, so that it's always open to exit. So just something to remember if you're leaving early. We'll go upstairs at the end of the day and show you the way out. But if you're leaving early, just let one of us know so we can show you the way out. Elevator is still working, so if you need the elevator, that's no problem. So it is my pleasure to introduce Alisa today. The iconic musical Fiddler on the Roof continues to delight and enthrall audiences even a half century since its premiere. From Broadway and major theater productions to small-town high school performances, Fiddler on the Roof has been performed over and over again far and wide, celebrating its major cultural impact on audiences the world over. The Broadway musical, based on the characters of Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem, debuted in 1964. It follows the story of Tevye the Milkman and his rise from the humble New York Yiddish stage to ultimate stardom of Hollywood. It spoke of Jewish traditions, but more so of conflicts and drama of the times, all of which are still relevant today. Loss of tradition, generational tension, and modern life moving too fast. From Warsaw to Japan, from major cities to small villages, Fiddler on the Roof has touched a chord with millions. Alisa Solomon explores the history and many nuances and reasons behind the enduring popularity of this beloved musical and its characters. Alisa teaches at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, where she directs the Arts and Culture concentration in the MA program. A theater critic and cultural and political reporter for the Village Voice from 1993 to 2004, she has also contributed to the New York Times, The Nation, Tablet, The The Forward, The Daily Beast, HowlRound.com, and many other publications. Her first book, Redressing the Canaan, Essays on Theater and Gender, won the George Jean Nathan Award for Dramatic Criticism. Alisa also works as a dramaturg, most recently with Anna DeVere Smith on her one-woman show, Let Me Down Easy. She serves on the Scholars Council of Theater for a New Audience. Please join me in welcoming Alisa to New Canaan today. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for the kind introduction and for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here as a joint program of the Library of New Canaan as well as the Jewish Historical Society, and I thank both institutions, and have to get my book out so I can read it. Okay, so 40 pages of script must be cut. No arguments, this is fact. If this means cutting whole scenes, do it now before the physical production gets put into work so we are not trapped later in immovable situations. That's what the director-choreographer Jerome Robbins wrote to the scriptwriter Joe Stein just about exactly 50 years ago. We're just a few weeks off of 50-year anniversary of that letter, which was 2 months before they were to begin rehearsals for Fiddler on the Roof in New York, and then take it on the road to Detroit and Washington before opening in New York in September of 1964. And this was just the first paragraph of a very long memo with an ominous title, which was, "Book changes to be completed by author in April." The memo was one of those radiant diamonds one can find in archives, and I nearly whooped loud in the library in New York when I came across this in the Jerome Robbins papers at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts when I was researching Wonder of Wonders. Among various script and song drafts, letters, diary notes, phone message logs, and scores of interviews, this memo was especially revealing of Jerry Robbins's thinking about the show's shape and sensibility. Its 3 single-spaced pages read like a primer on how to construct a mid-century musical, written by one of the greatest architects the form has ever known. Robbins gave Stein barely 30 days, and he was adamant. That spring, Robbins had been dashing back and forth between New York and Philadelphia on a rescue mission for Funny Girl, which was trying out of town in Philadelphia, which Robbins originally was to have directed. And the baggy mess he was helping to clean up was leaving him anxious about the Fiddler play he was working on back in New York. In the memo to Stein, Robbins wrote, "Having been through terrible fire and insolvable problems with Funny Girl, I absolutely refuse to repeat the same experience and have anyone else suffer from it. The book needs 40 pages out of it. Let's solve things now and save screaming later." Well, there was still plenty of screaming in the making of Fiddler on the Roof in the 5 months that followed, at least in the quiet, steaming form in which Jerry Robbins tended to upbraid people. But the notes from the beginning of April set forth his plan for streamlining the show and putting its emphasis on the story of Tevye as a man in a state of transition. "You must," he wrote to Joe Stein, "you must dramatize the tension of his struggle to keep his traditions while being assailed by outside forces that are projected in terms of his daughters and their suitors." Well, we know by now, we've known for half a century, how diligently Joe Stein followed Robbins's advice. As I hardly need to tell you, the show was a blockbuster success. Fiddler reached its 900th performance in New York in November 1966, 26 months after the premiere, without having had one empty seat, and not even one empty standing room spot. In that short time, just over 2 years, the producer, Hal Prince, had returned a profit of 352% to the investors, not including the film deal, which was already in the works by then. More surprising, very quickly, Fiddler became not just a great show, but something much more than a show. In Wonder of Wonders, I tell the story of where Fiddler came from, beginning with the Sholem Aleichem masterful Tevye de Milchiker stories, and then show how it was hammered out through rehearsals and tryouts by bringing readers backstage into that process, and then go beyond that to show how it gathered cultural utility in a variety of significant places in its long and healthy afterlife. So that is, in the third part, I take up what more the show has become. And today, I want to share one stellar example of how Fiddler turned into folklore. But before I show that example, I want to flash back a little bit and think about how Jerry Robbins ended up in this position to begin with. After all, even though he was a famed Broadway director and choreographer by this point, and choreographer in the dance world, tearing the world up as well, he was estranged from his Jewishness as a young man. The name change from Rabinowitz being just the surface manifestation. So I want to read a little bit from Wonder of Wonders that starts to suggest how his interest began to emerge. In 1959, Robbins took his young dance company, Ballets USA, on an official tour sponsored by the U.S. State Department. Over nearly 5 months, they performed in 18 cities, and one of them was Warsaw. The grueling itinerary gave Robbins and his company 4 full days in that city, and Robbins impulsively decided to spend one of them looking for the shtetl where his father, Harry Rabinowitz, had been born. Several decades premature for the Jewish heritage tourist industry, Robbins hired a chauffeur. The watchful and tourist system would not have permitted him to rent a car and go exploring on his own, and asked the driver to take him and one of his dancers, Jamie Bauer, whom he invited along for the day, to Rozhanka. On a chilly morning, they headed east out of Warsaw, driving for hours over the flat, farm-dotted terrain toward a misty memory. Robbins had spent a summer in Rozhanka some 35 years earlier. When he was almost 6 years old, his mother took him to meet his grandfather, Nathan Meyer Rabinowitz. They sailed to England, then traveled to London, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, and across Poland by train. A horse-drawn wagon carried them over unpaved roads and finally turned down the shtetl's main street. Robbins's grandfather, a baker, still lived in the thatch-roofed house that Harry, his father, had left in 1904, fleeing from conscription into the Tsar's army and then following his 2 older brothers to America. His parents had to buy a cemetery plot, bury an empty coffin, and bribe a clerk for a death certificate to cover his disappearance. In the interwar period, unlike much of Poland, Rozhanka was neglected by most of the factors vying for support among the country's 3.3 million Jews. Communists, Bundists, and Hasidim lacked inroads there. Only the Zionists were organizing amid the 120 Jewish families, about 600 people, who populated the town, along with about 40 Christian families. The Zionist youth group established a drama club the year of young Jerry's visit and presented a range of Yiddish plays, among them Moshe the Tailor, The Way to Buenos Aires, and King Lear. But what captured his heart in what Robbins called the tiny town with dirt streets and kerosene lamps was a sense of being carefree and thoroughly content. Never mind the lack of electricity or indoor plumbing. Playing outdoors all day with the local children, catching fish from the brook, making mud houses, all of it might have seemed idyllic to any urban American boy. But Jerry's happiness ran deeper. In Rozhanka, he felt no shame about being a Jew. He sat on his grandfather's lap, cuddled against his chest, and, he wrote later, this figure with a long white beard, who I loved a lot and I knew loved me, sang Yiddish songs. It was a time of soft and beautiful loveliness. It was my home that I belonged to. Robbins recalled those days with a wistfulness not found in any of his other reminiscences of childhood. He recorded these memories some 5 decades later. On the tape, he chokes back a sob as he claims his belonging. By then, he had seen with his own eyes that Rozhanka was no more. The shtetl's demise began with the German incursion in January 1942. Parachutists, a tank, some motorcycles with machine guns. The Russian army retook the town, then lost it again, and by mid-September, Nazis seized total control. Before the end of the year, they sent all of Rozhanka's Jews to the ghetto in nearby Schutzen. The following April, the ghetto was liquidated, its captives sent to the slaughter. When he went looking for Jewish Rozhanka in 1959, Robbins found nothing. But he likely found it in the wrong place. In 1904, when Harry Rabinowitz, his father, stole away from Rozhanka, the shtetl belonged to the vast Tsarist Empire. 2 decades later, when Jerry, as a 6-year-old, sang Yiddish songs on his grandfather's knee, the post-World War I borders enclosed Rozhanka within the Republic of Poland. But by the time the celebrated choreographer felt a sudden urge in Warsaw in 1959 to see what had become of his ancestral home, the border had been dragged westward, and he would have needed a Soviet visa to go there. Not something available on a whim to an American in 1959, even, or maybe especially, to an American on an official U.S. tour. And his passport from the period bears no trace of a Soviet stamp. Even if his Polish driver had been brash enough to dare it, a wink and some hard currency at the border crossing would have presented a striking scene after several hours of driving across flat countryside, and Robbins's companion didn't recall one. Where, then, did they go? Could the driver, in all innocence, have taken Robbins to a Polish village, also called Rozhanka, that lies just west of Belarus and north of Lublin? Or to either of the other 2 Polish towns with that name, though one of them lies west of Warsaw and the other considerably south? In some sad sense, it doesn't matter. If there once had been Jews in any of them, their traces would have been gone. Just about every Polish shtetl suffered some version of Rozhanka's tale of invasions and roundups and deportations. Before the hundreds of shtetls that were scattered through Poland were astonishingly diverse, as different from one another as industrial production is from ox-driven agriculture, from a Hasidic community, from an anti-Hasidic one. But in destruction, they all looked alike. Ruination felt the same, whether it was a textile factory or a barn, a bathhouse, or a tavern that was appropriated by Poles or reduced to rubble. That's one reason the extraordinary Yiskerbücher, the collectively created post-Holocaust memorial books of maps, anecdotes, town histories, and martyrologies that retrieve a community for history, take similar form and tone no matter which of the hundreds of shtetls is memorialized. Survivors who assembled these Yiskerbücher from municipal records and oral histories, their own urgent memories and storehouse of literary tropes, understood that their towns, though separate and distinct, became parts of a whole through their obliteration. Each was specific, and each was also representative. A contributor to one Yiskerbuch captured this consciousness by describing his town as the Anatevka of our youth and childhood dreams. Though this writer was actually from Rudki, which lies 25 miles west of Lviv in what is now Ukraine, he was invoking the name of the fictional shtetl in Stories by Sholem Aleichem as a way of marking the way each ruined town now stood for them all through their own common fate. Jerry Robbins would help give Anatevka that same meaning for a vast worldwide audience. But in 1959, the name meant nothing to him. Still, he now knew how the shtetl had become a figment of memory and imagination. On the long ride back to Warsaw for an evening performance at the looming Palace of Culture, the seeds of Fiddler were planted within him. It would take an outside impetus, though, before he could promise, as he said, to give the shtetl a new life on stage. And that impetus came 2.5 years later in the form of a draft script for a musical. That draft, of course, was by Joe Stein and the brilliant music and lyrics team of Jerry Bach and Sheldon Harnick. And there was one more genius who had so much to do with the making of Fiddler that before I get back to the choreography that turned into folklore, I think it's only fair to give him a little equal time since he was Jerry Robbins' nemesis. And I'm talking about, and maybe you've guessed, the first man to play and to help mold the character of Tevye, Zero Mostel, whom you see there gesturing towards Shalom Aleichem. Robbins and Mostel hated each other, not least because Robbins had infamously named names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and Zero Mostel, though not named specifically by Robbins, had been named and as a result was blacklisted for years, unable to find work in film or TV. Still, Robbins knew that Mostel was the best man for the part, and Mostel, raised in an observant Yiddish-speaking household, knew, well, that he was the best man for the part. Robbins began rehearsals with the young people and the villagers, and meanwhile did research, going to Orthodox weddings and holiday celebrations to see ritual practice in action. When Zero Mostel blasted into rehearsals after the second week, he started ridiculing Robbins right away. "A couple of weddings in Williamsburg, and that putz thinks he understands Orthodox Jews," he'd snort, with a roll of the eyes that seemed to trace the full circumference of the globe. Mostel vied for power with everything he had: comic charm, deep personal knowledge of Yiddishkeit, colossal talent, sheer volume and size, but always indirectly. Like an overgrown class clown, he shared his jibes and naughty asides to the other actors. He never confronted Robbins directly, but he baited him. One day, every time Robbins turned his back, Mostel shook his ample behind at him. The next day, he carried out the same routine, only this time he gave Robbins the finger. On another occasion, when Robbins insisted Mostel stop chomping on chewing gum during rehearsal, the actor stuck the gum behind his ear and popped it back in his mouth and began gnawing lustily when Robbins looked away. Once, he tromped across the back of the stage with a bucket on his foot while Robbins was talking to other actors. Day after day, he found a way to entertain his fellow cast members at the director's expense, and most of the company, especially the younger actors, cheered him on with their laughter. The more one feared Robbins, it seemed, the more one appreciated Mostel's poke at his authority and the prospect that maybe Robbins feared Mostel. Robbins silently endured Mostel's shenanigans. How hard he had to work to keep from blowing his stack, no one knew, but he never exploded. Not at Mostel, anyway. He could be curt with Joe Stein, barely looking up when the writer passed him new pages. He could be cutting with actors. He called Tanya Everett, who played Chava, fatso, even though she was nothing of the kind. He carved incessantly at B. Arthur, who played Yenta, driving her off the stage in tears. But with Mostel, Robbins always stayed businesslike. And if his own acting was involved, Mostel responded in kind. When both were concentrating on a scene, their working relationship simmered, in Stein's description, at 2 degrees below hostile. Robbins said little to Mostel by way of direction, and that was plenty, since Mostel, endlessly inventive, needed little prodding. When they argued at all, it was over substance, and often over Jewish substance. "What are you doing?" Robbins demanded at one rehearsal, as Mostel touched the doorposts of Tevye's house and then brushed his fingers over his lips. Mostel offered the obvious answer: "I'm kissing the mezuzah." Robbins responded bluntly, "Don't do it again." But Mostel insisted that Tevye, like other Orthodox Jews with whom the actor had grown up, would never neglect to make the customary gesture of devotion that acknowledges the case of sacred parchment affixed to the doorway of Jewish homes. Robbins bristled. Mostel held firm and kissed the mezuzah again. Without raising his voice, in fact, the more emphatic he became, the more firmly and calmly he spoke, Robbins demanded that Mostel stop. The actor relented, and then, when he walked through Tevye's doorway once more, he crossed himself. He'd made and won the point, and the mezuzah kissing stayed in. In doing the field research that Mostel so merrily mocked, Robbins attended Orthodox holiday celebrations and weddings, bringing along Joe Stein, Jerry Bach, and Sheldon Harnick, and later members of the design team and the cast. The men's dancing that he saw at these celebrations came as a revelation to Robbins. The last thing he expected to see was the men's floor-stomping, body-twisting, athletic flinging, and writhing. In handwritten notes, Robbins marveled. My great wonder, watching the dancers, was how people weren't hurt and bruised as bodies were flung centrifugally from out-of-control circles. Hats flew off, chairs overturned, but the rough, dominant force that was released by all this kinetic energy was overpowering. Two things held them together. Their constant hand grip, when if broken by the external momentum of the dance or by another body flinging itself into the dancer, was always regained, reunited. And secondly, the deep and powerful assertion, a strength I never knew, a dedication to a right, claiming survival and joy, procreation and celebration, an explosive foot thrust to the floor that shook the room and said, yes, I am here and I celebrate the continuity of my existence. This was a profound reaction for a man who had long felt shame about what he regarded as weak Jewish masculinity. Now, that stereotype was pulverized by the whirling frenzy of these dances. From the beginning of his work on the show, Robbins insisted that it emphasize Jewish robustness and resilience, not cutesy sentimentality. The dancing he saw at weddings provided the proof positive and further inspiration for that demand. Something else intrigued him too at these celebrations. A man with a rusty beard who seemed to be a regular at the weddings, entertaining the guests by weaving through them with a particular trick. Robbins' consultant, the Jewish dance expert Devorah Lapson, had seen such antics during research in Europe, and she told Robbins he was performing a Flaschentanz, a caper in which the man balances a bottle on his head as he dances, perhaps to prove himself sober. The image lodged itself in Robbins' imagination, and it simmered there, eventually to be transformed by his artistry, high emotion, and theatrical showmanship. It's impossible to know exactly and minutely the moves Robbins took from the frolics of the man with the red beard or from the communal cavorting among the Orthodox celebrations, the men at the Orthodox celebrations. But there's no doubt that Robbins embellished on what he observed. A dozen years earlier, and now I'm going to show some clips, so soon if you could dim those lights, that'd be great. Thanks. A dozen years earlier, when choreographing Small House of Uncle Thomas, the play within the play in The King and I, Robbins hit a dead end trying to create authentic Siamese dance, despite his extensive research into the genre. Only when Richard Rodgers urged him to take some license with the movement vocabulary was he able to break through his inhibition and devise an exciting 14-minute dance drama that conveyed Siamese-ness with its cocked legs, flexed feet and wrists, and wide-stance demi-pliés, but that borrowed from Balinese Logong dance, Peking opera, Japanese kabuki, as well as from Martha Graham, and most important, from Robbins' own imagination. Excited as Robbins had been by the dancing he'd seen at the weddings, he showed no signs of using that research in Fiddler. He didn't mention it in production meetings. He didn't bring it up in rehearsals in New York, nor when they got to Detroit, nor in the early days in Washington, D.C. Then one morning, about a week into the run in Washington, after the local reviewers had already declared Fiddler on the Roof a triumph, Robbins called a rehearsal of the male dance corps at 10 o'clock in the carpeted theater lobby. The men had no idea why he wanted them there. Robbins didn't say much by way of explanation when they assembled. He showed the troupe some steps, walking in a circle with some bounce in the knees to begin, and then, well, let's just say that the rehearsal was held in the carpeted lobby because Robbins knew that some bottles would be falling to the floor. He taught the troupe the moves in a few hours' time, and then Robbins called a put-in rehearsal for late that afternoon. The entire cast played through the wedding scene, and they burst into applause and some into tears when they saw the new number for the first time. That very night, it went into the show, and it has brought the house down ever since. Here is Robbins' choreographic genius radiantly on display. It's 2.5 riveting minutes of innovative movement that reveal situation and character, feed the action, and in its very form, encapsulate the show's ideals of Jewish revivification and cultural adaptation. Legendarily, the set designer, Boris Aronson, who'd been driven up the wall by the way Robbins was constantly changing his mind about the scenery, watched from the back of the house the first night the bottle dance went into the show. And at the close of the number, he turned to Jerry Robbins' assistant, Richard Altman, and he said, "Any man who can do that, I forgive everything." As in the movement in The King and I, in the bottle dance, Robbins similarly captured the spirit of the original by maintaining some essential elements: the balanced bottle, arms pumping heavenward, and as you'll see in a moment, the group in a frenzy. And then he built upon them with sheer choreographic ingenuity and show business panache. As you hear the music, tells you this is showbiz. Here it comes, folks. In its very form, the bottle dance embodies Fiddler's essential gesture by expressing what looks like a religious folk form within the idiom of a Broadway showstopper. In the film, as you'll see in a moment, the camera cuts away before you see the choreography's final pose. So we'll just wait till that moment. So the camera cuts away, but what they do, and this, of course, is from the film version, 1971, directed by Norman Jewison, on stage, right? It's the quintessential footlight finish, kind of like Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer, that other Rabinowitz who changed his name to Robbins to go into show business. And you just can't get any more razzmatazz than that. And this could be the end of the story, insofar as the last rehearsals in Washington reshaped the show for better and forever. But something so much larger happened with the bottle dance, and it's an emblem of Fiddler's own function of providing a usable ethnic past to Americans, even still, now in the 21st century. Through Robbins's genius, popular culture, as often happens, absorbed and remade an element of presumed folk culture, and then, amazingly, returned it to the folk, who have taken it up as their own authentic expression. The choreography Robbins made up has become, as you'll hear it called in a moment, and please listen for this particular phrase, an age-old, magnificent dance, and as a means of bringing Jewish tradition into a bar mitzvah, as if the bar mitzvah itself were not sufficient to the purpose. So I'm going to show you a commercial now for an actual troupe that you could hire.
Congratulations, you're planning a simcha, a wedding, a bar, a bat mitzvah, a 50th wedding anniversary. Now that's cause for a celebration. Obviously, you would love for your party to be something wonderful, something special and unique, not the same old, same old. Every one of the appearances of the amazing bottle dancers is indeed something wonderful and truly unique. What you're about to see will be that special something, the highlight that you and your guests will always remember.
Shmuel, Nachum, Ephraim, Moshe, if you have Maddie, bring her in!
And notice this is the fiddler music.
But wait, there's more. The rabbis go out into the audience, getting everyone up for a horror that no one will soon forget, featuring authentic klezmer music. So whether it's a birthday, anniversary, temple banquet or installation, Hanukkah party at your home, a black tie wedding or one in the backyard, a bar or bat mitzvah, the amazing bottle dancers is special for everyone, kids and adults. Hey, you don't even have to be Jewish to appreciate the humor, the tradition of this age-old, magnificent dance. And speaking of tradition, no matter how contemporary your simcha is, a little tradition never hurt.
So we bring, we turn to Broadway to find the tradition for our ritual observances. If assimilation was the throwing off of visible and audible signs of Jewishness, this troupe, the Amazing Bottle Dancers, which is the brainchild of a Hollywood actor named Michael Pasternak, signals a level of acculturation that's so comfortable and assured that these clothes and accents can be donned and celebrated within our sophisticated postmodern midst, but returning this time, as the repressed often does, as a joke. But the last laugh belongs to the Lubavitch Hasidim, who invited members of the Amazing Bottle Dancers to perform in their 28th annual Chabad telethon in this 2008, in this special number in 2008 with the actor Keith David. So we'll finish with this clip.
A fiddler on a tote board. Sounds crazy, no? But here at Chabad, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on a tote board, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without losing his hat. We work day and night, helping people in need with community centers, schools, and social programs. Now, it isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay up there if it's so difficult? We stay because the Chabad house is our home. And how do we keep our balance? Well, that I can tell you in one word. Telethon!
And here they come. So, the high-tech Lubavitchers Hasidim producing the telethon, and this one raised $8 million, by the way, are not only so secure in their own identity and practice that they can enjoy the joke of the Amazing Bottle Dancers, they're profoundly savvy about how images work in popular culture. And so, for popular television viewers, they can use the fake Hasidim and a Broadway musical to authenticate themselves for a mainstream audience. The familiar Jerry Robbins choreography, the song tradition, the African-American Hollywood tevya, all help to remove the aura of strangeness around the Hasidim and to move them into a familiar, fiddler-created comfort zone. This embraces Hasidim into American consciousness, where their lives can be not as shaky, but as stable as Fiddler on the Roof. This is a process that began half a century ago and shows no signs of slowing down yet. And I'm happy to have questions and conversation.
I had two and I forgot the second one. The first one is, do you know what the 40 pages that were cut out were about?
Yes, I do. Marcy asked about the 40 pages that Jerry Robbins required Joe Stein to cut out of that early draft. There were scenes, there were 5 full different drafts over the years that the artists worked on the show, and Bach, Harnick, and Stein worked on it for about a year and a half or more before Jerry Robbins came aboard the project. They had scenes of Tevye talking to his horse. Robbins thought it was not a good idea to bring an animal on the stage. Apart from all the technical difficulties, animals always upstage actors and are impossible to control. So there was that. A lot of the scenes were just flabbier. They weren't as concise as they could be. There was a very long scene. Actually, this was a dance scene that they rehearsed and played in Detroit and then cut before they went to Washington and then came here, of Tevye kind of melting down after Chava elopes with Fiedka. And it was a big, it was a 10-minute expressionistic scene with actors in the company, dancers, sort of, behind the scenery and moving the scenery around, and Mostel looking like the air was just going slowly out of him on the stage. And eventually, they decided it didn't work, and it's replaced with that very lovely little moment, if you know the show or the movie, where he sings Chavala, Chavala, and there's the little silhouetted dance of each daughter being courted away. So there was just a lot of stuff that could be done much more economically.
My second question is, because it appears on the surface to be a very Jewish play,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering about, was there a concern about raising money or actually being a hit?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes. So when Bach, Harnick, and Stein first started bringing it around to producers, before they had Jerry Robbins on the team, that was exactly the problem. A number of producers thought it was too Jewish. As they said, one of them infamously said, this is all very nice, but what are we going to do for ticket sales when we run out of Hadassah groups? But the artists making the show, I mean, despite Jerry Robbins' very personal connection, and after the fact, Bach, Harnick, and Stein all talked about their own personal connection, that's not what was in their minds when they were making it. They loved these stories. They thought, they were approaching it on a very human level, and the show works in a universal way as well, which I could talk about. Susan mentioned some of those themes already. So they were mistaken. There was another, yes?
A couple of questions. First of all, what made you write the book? And I have a follow-up to
Okay. This book was probably the most overdetermined thing I've ever done in my life. I'm trained as a theater scholar. My just down the road a piece in New Haven. I have a doctorate in theater history and dramatic literature, so I write about theater. Sometime in the 90s, I decided I wanted to learn Yiddish. My parents didn't speak it, and I did not grow up with it, but I felt that there was a whole rich world that I wanted to have access to, and I killed myself to learn Yiddish, and when I started reading Sholem Aleichem in Yiddish, it blew my mind, because I had thought of him, as most Americans do, as just this sort of quaint humorist. And in fact, he's a very complicated literary artist, and I got very excited about that. So those two things are kind of already, in my mind, but there was a specific moment when it happened, and that was in 2004. I was still a staff writer at The Voice. It was just a few months before I ended up leaving, and the Broadway revival of 2004 was announced. I hadn't thought about the show since I was a kid. Quite a long time earlier. And I went to the theater editor and I said, I want to do a preview feature, a little kind of essay about Fiddler on the Roof. Like, why do we have to see this show again? That was my attitude. Like, what do we need to see this sweet little show about these little Jewish weaklings, now that Jews are so well established and powerful and, all the rest of it. And my editor said, okay, go ahead. So the first thing I had to do was pick up the CD, which you could still do in those days, and listen to it, which I hadn't done for so long. I brought it home, I put it on. Like 2 bars in, I started to cry. From beginning to end, I sobbed all the way through listening to the CD. And I thought, okay, cynicism is not the proper approach. Something very deep is going on in this show. I've connected to something here, and I want to know what that is. And so I did some preliminary research for that piece. It was a 1,200-word story that ran in The Voice, and I had folders in my file cabinet up to here. And a little later, when I was starting to think about a project, I gave a talk about it somewhere, and a colleague chased me out of the room and said, "You should write a book about that." I thought, huh, he's right. So that's how it happened.
So I think in this paragraphs you wrote about Robbins going 1959.
Uh-huh.
Instead of, I think it's poignant. It's very, very deep, actually, because I think that sort of highlights what was lost. It's much deeper than, I mean, this is, that really tells the story. But maybe it's more than that, or the yearning
Mm-hmm.
that we all have as Jews for that life. So
Yeah.
the question is, well, what do you recommend for current and future Jewish generations to relive this, or try to educate people to relive this yearning for the
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a really interesting, that's a very interesting question. I'm going to come around, I hope, to the main part of the question about current generations and talk a little bit about the past. Because what I do in the first chapter of Wonder of Wonders actually is all about Shlomo Aleichem and his very pathetic and failed attempt to make it in the Yiddish theater in America. He was a complete flop in the theater until after his death. And the second chapter talks about when Shlomo Aleichem became very popular in English after the war. And the second chapter sort of argues that a ground was laid that made Fiddler possible, which was exactly what you're talking about, an appreciation and even a kind of romanticization of the shtetl past that happened through particular artworks and books, like The World of Shlomo Aleichem by Maurice Samuel, Life is with People, the sort of ethnography that was based on interviews with children of immigrants here, and these are the books that Robbins, Bach, Harnack, and Stein used for their research. And they painted a particular idea of the shtetl as a singular, idyllic place, and it was kind of figured in that period as one historian called it, the anti-suburb. That is, as Jews in America at this time were dispersing out of major urban centers like New York especially, into the suburbs, and having to work harder to be Jewish, basically, because it wasn't just in their streets. The question of what that communal cohesion would be that the shtetl had became a great concern. And so the idea of the shtetl as one kind of thing, and that's why I try to talk in the passage, you heard a bit of it that I read, about how different the shtetl were from each other in size, in focus, in what percentage of the population was Jewish or not, and so on. But by the early 60s, there was this sort of singular notion of the shtetl ideal, and as a place where people, were materially poor but rich in spirit, was how a number of people talked about it. So this is an image that Fiddler took from these sources, and that I think has carried forward for a lot of it. So what about the new generation? Like, how can they relate to this and find it as a rich source? I think the good thing is that there's so much more scholarship now about the variegated lives of these shtetls that we can have a realistic and still affectionate relationship to this history that, for those of us who are Ashkenazi, our grandparents or great-grandparents came from. I think that there's resistance to it when it just seems all sentimentalized and sort of too good to be true, and can't we we have to recognize that poverty is never easy, that the constraints of gender roles is not to everyone's liking, or it doesn't work for them. And there are historians and current historians, young Yiddish scholars and historians of Eastern Europe who are writing just amazing books about this period that I think give us a much fuller picture and allow us to have a much fuller response, therefore. And I think also in a different sphere, the klezmer revival is a big part of that, too. Yes?
What was the reception in Israel in the 1960s when the show broke such ground in New York?
That's my chapter 5 of Wonder Wonders. So did everybody hear the question? How did the show go over in Israel in the 60s? So Israel was the first foreign production. The show went all over the world. By 1971, it played in Finland 15 times by the time the film came out. But it went to Israel before it went anywhere else. And the Israelis had a different, maybe you're asking it for this reason, a different relationship toward that Eastern European past, which they were really trying to suppress and not talk much about as they were building the new Jew, who was not, not supposed to be that stooped over yeshiva bacher, but was supposed to be, the brawny guy out, digging the ditches. And if you've read Tom Segev's book, I can't think of what it's called, 7th Million, about the refugees who came after the Holocaust to Israel. There's some shocking information in that history by the Israeli historian Tom Segev about how they were treated by the sort of pioneers of the Zionist movement, told not to speak Yiddish in public and stuff like that. So by all accounts, Fiddler should not have been embraced there. It was people expected that it was going to be something kind of kitschy and terrible and so on. But in fact, it was produced by a very interesting character who was trying to bring Broadway theater standards of commercial theater into Israel, which hadn't happened before. He'd just done My Fair Lady, and then he did Fiddler, and it was a big hit. And it was in a way, it was kind of because it came from America. One of the writers in the Israeli press actually commented on how we get this history back through America and how weird that was. But I think because it had that distance, they were able to embrace it in a sort of paradoxical way. Yes.
I just want to add something, just say something. When you asked about handing it down, I do choreography, and sometimes I work with schools. And whenever you do Fiddler on the Roof,
Yeah.
you get not only the score, the music, and the script, but you get the choreography. And you try to recreate it in the words, and you use. So these generations of kids are learning. You can't just talk about the movement. You got to talk about what the movement means. And
Yeah.
and to hold together and the tradition of the unity of the. And it's brilliant choreography.
It is. It's astonishing choreography.
Right, so
Yeah.
that's been handed down for 50 years, so that's something.
Yeah, and thank you for that point. I think that often, I have a chapter about a junior high production in Wonder of Wonders as well, and partially because it was such a fascinating particular case of it was a black junior high, mostly black and Latino school in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in the middle of a very ugly black-Jewish fight. Of course they do. Between the mostly Jewish teachers union and the black community, and they did the show. And but also it's there because I think a lot of the ways these plays, these important shows, stay in our culture is not just on Broadway. That's the least of it. Most people know these shows because they do them in their high schools, or their kids are in them, or the summer camp, or community theaters. These shows have just such a vibrant life, and I think I agree with your comment in response to this gentleman's question. That a lot of this is passed down through kids who do the show in these various situations. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Can you touch on why Zero Mostel was turned down for the movie?
Yes, I more than touch on it. I explain it. Yes. Norman Jewison, the director of the movie, did not like Zero Mostel's performance. He told me flat out. He thought that Zero was larger than life, which is actually why Jerry Robbins wanted him for the stage. He was a great stage performer, though he ad-libbed all kinds of shenanigans after a while. But that on screen, he just didn't work so well. Jewison just didn't like him as an actor. The other thing is, and this goes a little bit to the question about Israel. By the time the film was being made, several years later, there's, seismic change had happened in Jewish American consciousness, namely the Six-Day War of 1967. Fiddler was Jewish America's proudest moment until then. And it really changed how we thought about things largely. And Jewison, who, by the way, is not himself Jewish, despite his name, really identified with the mission of Israel, and he wanted a tough Tevye. He didn't want a Tevye who shrugged at God. He wanted a Tevye who shook his fist, and he got that in Chaim Topol. Well, that's what he told me. No?
He wanted a clean version of Tevye. He wanted the Anglo-Saxon version of Tevye. I mean, Dear Marcel was just too much of the shtetl to be seen, and he felt the world couldn't accept that in the film.
I agree. I mean, that's another way of saying part of what I'm saying about him wanting the...
Well, that was a bad thing to do.
I'm not a big fan of Topol's performance myself. Anyone else? Yeah.
One last one.
Sure.
So this research they did to find out more about the shtetl, where did they go to do the research?
Okay, so they read some of these books that I mentioned. They looked at some films. They looked at a very interesting Soviet film. It's called Laughter Through Tears in English. That is based on two Sholem Aleichem stories. And it's interesting because Robbins' notes about it talk about how it shows the grittiness of, this Jewish life, where, of course, the Soviet idea of this film was more that, these were the benighted Jews before the revolution came and, brought them enlightenment. They looked at that film. And by they, I mean Robbins, he required his designers and everyone to see this stuff. They read these books and others. Robbins amassed a library of about like 70 books, all cataloged in his papers that he read, lots of photographs. And then they went to celebrations in Williamsburg, in Manhattan, to Orthodox weddings and other kinds of celebrations. Yes?
Do you have any background information about the writing of the songs, the lyrics, and the music?
Yeah, the question was about the writing of the songs and the music. Yes, I was very lucky to be able to interview Sheldon Harnick, the lyricist, on many occasions, and he gave me his folder of lyrics that weren't used in the show, and they write at a ratio of about 3-to-1. That is, for every song that's in the show, there's like 3 that aren't. And while I never got to speak with Jerry Bach, I did correspond with him before his death about his songs, and he's given a lot of interviews in the past. And I got my hands on some tapes. The way the two of them worked was one of them would have an idea. Usually Bach would start with a musical idea, but not always. And he'd tinkle a little on the piano and hum along to it, and then he'd send the tape. He was living in Westchester and Harnick in Manhattan. He'd send the tape by mail to Harnick, and Harnick would listen to it and then tinker around and come up with some words, and then they'd get together in a studio in New York and work on it together. And I got my hands on some of those tapes that Jerry Bach had sent to Harnick to hear some of the early ideas that he had. And there were some of these books that I mentioned, like Life is with People. There are things in the lyrics that come right out of these books, or come right out of the translation of the stories by Sholem Aleichem, which was the only extant one at the time by Francis Butlin. They're right in the lyrics. And I think my favorite story about the lyrics is that while they were in Detroit, they wrote a new song for Muddle, Wonder of Wonders, Miracle of Miracles. That was not his song at first. That was they gave it to Perchik and wrote a new song for him, partly because Austin Pendleton, who was a terrific actor, was not a great singer. He had a somewhat limited range, and he just wasn't pulling off the more difficult song. So Sheldon and Jerry Bach wrote it in their hotel in Detroit, and Sheldon told me that they had this idea about miracles, but he, couldn't remember his Bible too well, and luckily there was a Gideon Bible in his hotel room, and, he was just spent a night flipping through it looking for all the miracles he could put into the song. Yes, sir. Yes. Very well. It's played in Turkey, for sure. I believe it played in Jordan once. It's played in, I don't know whether it's played in Egypt. I didn't come across that. I know the film has been shown in Egypt, but I don't know if it's been staged in Egypt. Yes? Sorry.
Was Shalom Aleichem a journalist, and what were his political views? Was he sympathetic to the revolutionary type of movement?
The question is about Shalom Aleichem and his politics, and was he a journalist, and what did he have to say about that? I have some ideas about that, but I would refer you to scholars of Shalom Aleichem. I mean, there's a wonderful new biography of him by Jeremy Dauber that came out about a week before my book came out. I love that book in every way, except that it didn't come out 2 years earlier, because I killed myself reading the only biography of Shalom Aleichem other than this one that's just come out, which is the 5-volume memoir by his son-in-law in Yiddish. So what I can say is there's a lot of disputing about what were Shalom Aleicham's actual political views. I think the best answer is that they shifted over time. He wrote a novel, its name is escaping me at the moment, The Flood, that is about the revolutionary movements. It has a character who's caught up in the revolution and others, and he's sympathetic to it early on, but then he gets has some qualms about it later. Certainly the 1905 revolution and the institution of Constitution, all that he's very excited about and in favor of, but he seems to lose some enthusiasm later. To what extent he was a Zionist or not is also very much debated among scholars. Ruth Weiss, who's one of the most important Shalom Aleichem scholars, is very insistent that he was a Zionist to the core to the day he died, and she even reads his stories as, Zionist parables almost. Other scholars think that he wrote a pamphlet early on, a sort of pro-Zionist pamphlet, but that later he abandoned that and was not, he wasn't hostile to it, but he just wasn't really behind it that much anymore. So he kind of shifted around on those. He wasn't a journalist per se, though he wrote for newspapers. So his stories, the Tevye stories, among others, were serialized in newspapers. The Tevye stories, there are 8 or 9 of them, depending how you count if the last one is a fragment or not. A new version of the 8th one or a new one in its own right, another thing that scholars debate, over a 20-year period in periodicals. But every now and then he'd be asked to write other things. So for example, in 1905, he came to New York after a pogrom in Kiev, where he was living with his family, and they were, cowering during this pogrom, and he was invited to write a series of pogrom letters describing what was happening then that were published in the Yiddish press, and also some of them translated and published in the English language press in 1905 in the U.S. Yes, sir. 1905.
This might be peripheral, but when I see Mark Chagall painting,
Mm-hmm.
I see imagery.
Yeah.
I see him either drawn from the show or drawn from the story or from Shalom Aleichem story. Do you know what's the...
Yeah. The question is about what's the connection of Chagall to Fiddler on the Roof, and the answer is deep. Jerry Robbins, Chagall was from Vitebsk, I never can say that, in Russia, and painted these fanciful versions of shtetl life, even though his family had moved to a more urban kind of setting. And Robbins had that visually in mind for the show, and he actually invited Chagall to design the set. Mr. Chagall was too busy and said no thanks. And then Boris Aronson was hired. And Aronson was born in Kiev, worked in the Moscow Jewish State Art Theater, the Yiddish State Art Theater in Moscow, in that exciting, early revolutionary period where he was friends with Marc Chagall. And then he came to the U.S., stopping in Germany for about 18 months, where he wrote a book about Chagall. And so when Robin said to him, "I want a Chagall feeling here," Aronson knew better than anyone what that meant. And the title, Fiddler on the Roof, comes specifically from Chagall images as well.
One more question, anyone?
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Doesn't sound like you ever get tired of talking about it. See, that's one of the advantages to being a librarian, doing selection. Yeah. Great.
Are we selling books, signing books?
The bookstore was not able to come today. I know. I don't know why, but. Oh.